Well, good evening and welcome to the latest edition of the Definite Article, where we discuss a recent article or publication. I'm Syed Kamall, the IA's Academic and Research Director. And tonight we'll be discussing a recent City AM article titled Tax System to the Rescue, 6 Policy Tweaks that Could Kickstart the Economy. Awakening the economy from months of enforced hibernation and ensuring a rapid recovery is going to be a major challenge. So what role will tax policy play, both in the immediate term and looking to the future? Well, City AM asked a number of experts, and we're going to ask a few ourselves to discuss what changes they would make to the tax system to get Britain's economy back on track in a post-COVID world. I'm joined this evening by 2 of the contributors to that City AM article, Professor Philip Booth, Senior Academic Fellow at the IEA, and Matt Kilcoyne, Deputy Director of the Adam Smith Institute, as well as Duncan Simpson, Research Director at the Taxpayers Alliance, and John Ashmore, Editor of CapX, the media arm of the Centre for Policy Studies. So why don't we start with you, Philip? Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us this evening. Philip, in City AM, you've called for the abolition of corporation tax. Why, in your view, is this not fit for purpose?
Well, I should say that this isn't particularly a sort of post-COVID policy. It's something which I've been advocating for some time, and I'm not sure that the COVID agenda or the problems posed by COVID makes much of a difference to the argument. Corporation tax kind of worked as a tax when companies had lots of fixed capital, their domicile was fairly obvious, and most of their investors were actually living in the same place as the company was operating. Then, of course, you had the development of international investment, and when we removed exchange controls after 1979, that exploded much more dramatically. Even then, corporation tax was kind of just about workable when you had lots of investors from lots of different countries, which perhaps invested in companies which are operating overseas, and countries had double taxation agreements to try to prevent people being taxed twice on their income. No, once when the company was taxed as a corporation, and then again when people received dividends as income. But now so much capital within companies is intangible, and it can be located almost everywhere, and transfer pricing systems are used to determine what profits are booked in what countries. It really has become an impossible system to administer. And I think we should just go back to first principles, where we were, in fact, before we had a corporation tax system. And we should start taxing investors on the dividends that they receive according to the taxpayers' own tax status. That's exactly how we treat the investors in loan capital within companies. And it would therefore remove the distortion between debt and equity finance, which would remove some of the incentives which exist, especially in the financial sector, for gearing up companies. Of course, it would make it administratively much more difficult for the tax authorities, so the tax authorities wouldn't like it, but it would be a much fairer system and have far fewer distortions. And you could rip up huge parts of the tax code, which are designed to stop people gaming the current incoherent, well, not incoherent, but current antiquated corporation tax system.
Well, Philip, you yourself admit to one of the criticisms of your proposal. What other criticisms have you heard, and how would you address those?
Well, one criticism is that what happens in relation to companies' retained earnings, because currently companies are taxed on their profits, and then dividends are remitted to individuals, and then there may be some further tax depending on the individual's tax status. Now, you could, so what I've just suggested, what would happen is that companies would pay dividends to shareholders, and then shareholders would pay tax on the dividends they received. So there is then a question of how do we tax retained earnings? Well, we could either do that through the capital gains tax system, because retained earnings tends to lead to an increase in the share price of a company, or we could actually tax shareholders on the basis of the earnings per share that a company makes, regardless of whether the company pays a dividend. That would actually give companies quite strong incentives to pay dividends, so that the shareholders had enough money to pay the tax that was due. And that would not be a bad thing. It would stop companies hoarding cash piles. So that's another criticism of the system. But other than, and I suppose a third issue is what happens to companies in poor countries who make profits in those poor countries, where all the owners of those companies are in rich countries. then you could argue that the government of the poor countries is providing certain services, law and order, criminal justice, defence and so on, from which those companies benefit, and they're not paying anything in terms of taxation for those services. Well, you could argue in favour of some other types of tax on a company, whether it be rates or land value type taxation or some kind of turnover tax, but that should be determined and a matter for the country itself in relation to the companies which are operating within that company's borders, and would not be an international matter. Although in general, I think turnover taxes are a pretty bad idea.
All right, Fred. Well, thank you very much. Before I turn to our other guests, can I just remind viewers on our IEA London YouTube channel to hit the subscribe button, and also feel free to submit any questions after you've signed in to YouTube. Matt, let me turn to you. In the very same article, you've suggested that you've called for the scrapping of the factory tax. What do you mean by that? Can you explain that to us, and how do you think that could boost economic recovery?
You're right. It's a sort of a term that we've used, which is sort of an invented term for what is sort of known in more sort of academic circles as full expensing. Now, it relies on Philip's idea not being implemented because there is a corporate tax system that exists, but we think that it's unlikely that they're going to scrap corporation tax overnight. Whereas it's a bit more likely that they'll tinker around the edges when it comes to sort of annual allowances for investment. And so one of the things that matters is that when your business buys pens and paper, it pays salaries, it has running costs, all of those things get discounted against your profit level for the year, and that's what you end up. That's your losses. Those losses are then discounted for your profit level. That profit level is then what you pay corporation tax upon. And actually, the way in which the UK treats sort of bigger pieces of investment, things like machinery and buildings, is that you discount that not over the first year. You don't have that as a loss in your first year. You discount it over a number of years. That then doesn't take into account things like inflation or real return of capital, and that actually therefore that depreciation over a period of time acts as a form of tax. The UK is really, really, really bad at this. We have the lowest level of private investment as a fixed share of capital in the GDP in the G7 for over 2 decades. We have declined in terms of our manufacturing sector by more than any other G7 nation because it's not worthwhile investing in big capital projects here in the UK. We are exceptionally hostile. The UK is even across the OECD, we're ranked 33rd in the OECD. It is really much about discouraging investment actually in the UK. And it was a choice. It was a political choice, and it got even worse in the last government, not the last one, the one before that. George Osborne had a bias towards cutting corporation tax rather than cutting investment taxes in the UK. Now, as we leave restrictions on revenue raising, which is what the sort of the fall in GDP is in this current recession, we have a choice about whether we make it easier to transact, whether we make it easier to invest, whether we make it easier to employ people, whether we make it more and more expensive. So we were saying, actually, one of the ways in which the UK can solve both a lack of investment into our economy, but also the productivity crisis that underlies a lot of the bigger problems in UK prosperity, is by removing those taxes, those effective tax rates on businesses' investment. So that's why we're saying we should abolish the factory tax.
Matt, I'm going to ask you a similar question that one asked Philip. You've clearly put the idea out there in the past. What sort of criticisms have you had, and which criticisms have you had to take on board?
So we usually get a criticism from accountants who have a little bit of a vested interest in making sure that they've got a little bit of work.
Don't upset the accountants.
Never upset accountants. They get very, very technical about whether something should be depreciated in its first year, second year, third year, fourth year, or fifth year. Most people do get it, though. In fact, actually, if you ask the Federation for Small Business, if you ask CBI, if you ask the IOD, the number one tax that companies want to see removed is this tax. It has been for multiple years. And it's because a lot of their plans put on ice by political uncertainty. If you make things much more certain in terms of the financials, then you end up boosting investment, you end up getting it. Now, we think actually, we think that you can end up with over £2,000 more labour productivity per worker. Now, after decades of we've had over for a decade 0.3% per annum productivity growth in the UK, usually actually the criticism that we get from like government is that it's expensive. That it would be roughly equatable to about 8 billion upfront cost. And we're saying, well, if you just spent 120 billion and you're worried that the economy's gone off a cliff, and you have no idea where the economy is going to bounce back, then the best way in which to do that is to give companies the ability to do that themselves, and take the hit from in the first year at the Treasury level, and then allow businesses to rebuild their investment base and their productive capacity in their own way.
Okay, well, let's turn to John. John, if there was one tax you could throw on the post-COVID bonfire, which one would it be?
I'm going to concur with a sort of CPS colleague who's quoted in the article, Tom Clougherty, who says we should get rid of stamp duty.
That's very loyal of you.
Pretty much kind of universally reviled, not just by ordinary people moving house, but I've never come across an economist who thinks stamp duty is a great idea. It's a kind of dead weight tax. It discourages churn in the housing market, so old people are less likely to downsize, families are less likely to upsize. It doesn't raise that much revenue either. I think in the article, Tom describes it as something like the best free lunch going in terms of tax reform. And I'm inclined to agree. It's also a good example of one of the kind of broader problems in our tax system, which is that it's kind of this alluvial plain silted up with different measures from budget after budget where people tweak and add little bits. So you don't pay anything up to 300 grand, but only if you're a first time buyer. I think they were consulting on adding another 1% for foreign buyers at one point. There's all sorts of exemptions. There's different rates if you buy multiple properties at the same time. There's something like 11, I looked it up today, I think there are 11 different exemption sections just for stamp duty on the HMRC website. So I think that would be a good one to start with. I wouldn't go too far with it as a kind of panacea for the housing crisis. I think we need to do way more on that. Been some good sort of inklings on that, but I mean, personally, I think we need to just start from scratch and bring in something totally new, a kind of zoning-based system rather than this sort of discretionary thing that is just not working. But I think it would help, on the margins of the housing crisis with affordability, and reducing that, and increasing that the kind of churn that we need to make that housing market more efficient. I mean, we all know that this is essentially, probably COVID notwithstanding, the biggest economic problem we have in this country, both in terms of rents and prices, people unable to get on the ladder. So I think something to deal with that, which is relatively straightforward, that would be my priority.
Well, as you all know, a number of free market classical liberal think tanks agree and have written about scrapping stamp duty. But it's interesting, your colleague Tom, in the article, as you say, says scrapping stamp duty is a free lunch. You've also heard that many people say there's no such thing as a free lunch. So what criticisms have you heard about the proposals to scrap stamp duty?
I mean, the main one, I guess, is just that it's a cost and that it's not particularly progressive because it'll help people who've already got enough money to move house, who tend to be higher up the income distribution. I mean, to me, that's, again, that comes back to a problem with the way we talk about taxes, which is that we tend to focus on the individual distributional impact of a certain tax change rather than looking at the efficiency and sensibleness of the system as a whole. And the point Tom's making there is that actually the increase in activity that we probably see if we cut that tax in terms of the number of moves and the efficiency that I mentioned before in the housing market mean that it might not pay for itself entirely, but it would certainly offset some of that cost to the Treasury of raising the money. So for me, I mean, it's a win-win and something we should definitely be looking at rather than just these kind of shaving off percentages at the edges, which seems to be the way we're doing it at the moment.
Okay, well, let's turn to Duncan now. Now, Duncan, I understand you had a recent research paper, Tax Reforms to Secure Recovery from Coronavirus. Can you talk our viewers through some of the recommendations in that paper?
Certainly. So within that, we propose around about £100 billion worth of tax cuts, which could be implemented this year, which is quite substantial. But if we look at the total amount of tax which is forecast to be raised this year, it's a little over 12 or 13%. So it's sizable, but sort of broken down in a few areas. So we, for example, suggest that we should just scrap capital gains tax. Similarly, the annual investment allowance should be increased quite substantially from £1 million to £5 million, which essentially means there's a relief to buy plant and machinery. But so the main element of that paper discusses national insurance, and we think that both employer and employee national insurance should be altered quite substantially. So sort of immediately what would happen on the employer side with that, effectively this would be abolished, and that would be done till October. And when October runs around, then a sort of a new levy of 10% would be introduced. So currently it's about 13.8% for the employer element of that. And we sort of ran through some of the numbers towards this, and we worked out that if there was a company of 50 staff, the saving for that company over the course of, well, sort of from now until the end of the financial year in March, would be almost £45,000. On the employee side, the process was again very similar. So again, sort of full abolition, and then a reintroduction of that 10% levy, but not till April next year. So for someone on an average wage, so median earnings in the UK, so it's about £26,000, that would mean a saving of almost £1,600 less national insurance you'd be paying this year. When that levy is reintroduced rather next year, then some of that is sort of recouped for the Treasury. So you'd still be looking at a saving next financial year for that kind of wage of about £300. And we think this is quite a priority at the moment, because obviously there's been a lot of talk recently of cutting VAT. Ultimately, a lot of people who are on the furlough scheme at the moment are in this kind of suspended animation, whereby even there might not be a sort of a formal notice period from their employer, which is to bring about the termination of their employment, that's very likely to happen unless there's very good incentive for that employer to retain staff. National insurance as a tax for most businesses is pretty steep. I mean, staffing costs vary between industry, but you're looking sort of between 60 and 70% of outgoings has to be through their elements. And so, it would have the twin benefit of sort of encouraging firms to not go through mass redundancies and enforce that, as well as helping out quite a few people who might right now or very shortly find themselves without employment. So that's sort of the key element towards it. But I think doing as much as possible to buttress employment at this particular time is important, rather than facing what is going to be a likely very calamitous issue when the furlough scheme begins to wind down over the summer.
Now, when you discuss national insurance, you treat it as effectively as a tax. Most people see it as effectively another tax. But of course, it was originally intended to be some sort of form of social insurance. And there are some, we've got a forthcoming IA paper coming out on this, say should we look at national insurance again? And is there a way that we could make it true to its roots, if you like, and reform it so it becomes once again a social insurance, and people take responsibility for their, more responsibility for those unforeseen circumstances in their life?
Well, I mean, longer term, but we would like national insurance and income tax to be merged. And the reason for that is it's slightly fallacious when people put out this position of, ultimately, a lot of the revenue raised from the national insurance contributions goes to a national insurance fund, which nominally covers outgoings for pensions in the NHS. Obviously, that's topped up by general taxation otherwise, so never really has been functioning as social insurance. I think certainly in the future, with substantially higher outgoings on long-term healthcare and the life care as well, we will be spending substantially more on healthcare. And if there's a reasonable rationale for high degrees of sort of social insurance at some stage. Now, obviously, that would have to go hand in hand with pretty substantial elements of how you actually deliver healthcare already through the NHS and how we pay for that. But ultimately, national insurance should be scrapped and merged with income tax.
Okay, well, those are your sort of opening proposals or opening gambits for the viewers. Can I just remind viewers to hit the subscribe button on for the IA London YouTube channel, and also to submit any questions that you might have. Now, let's turn to the bigger political picture. And I'm going to ask all of you this question, starting with Philip. Boris Johnson this morning said, "This is the moment for a Rooseveltian approach to the UK." A big deal. What can we expect from his speech? Will his decade of investment on schools, hospitals, prisons, and transport work? Are massive infrastructure schemes the best way to stimulate growth? And when you think about Roosevelt, and I think it was the Robert Caro book on Lyndon B. Johnson, when he wrote about Roosevelt's sort of a New Deal bringing infrastructure to rural areas that would have had to wait years if it had been left to the market. What do you think he's going to say, Philip? And would it work?
Well, I don't know what he's going to say other than what you've just said. That it's reported that he's going to say, and I assume that whoever leaked that has a better idea than I do. So let's leave that to your speculation, and I'll deal with what I do know about, which is the economics of these issues. I think it's pretty frightening that somebody would boast about having a Rooseveltian New Deal approach to dealing with the current crisis, because it demonstrates an ignorance of history and an ignorance of economics. It demonstrates an ignorance of economics because what we have here is a clear and substantial supply side shock deliberately induced by the government. Potentially, I'm not arguing that the government shouldn't have done what it did, but the government decided to draw to a halt economic production in a whole range of areas. And if you have a supply side shock, then the response to that should be to liberate the supply side of the economy again. Now, quite a lot of that will simply be done as the lockdown begins to ease or ease further, and then further should be done in terms of liberalising regulation, liberalising, making the tax system more coherent, and this type of thing, the type of things that we're talking about right now, so that the supply side of the economy can get moving again. It's not a demand side shock, so you don't need demand side measures. It's as simple as that. Now, as far as the history is concerned, although this is linked to the economics as well, because the history of the Roosevelt program is that it didn't work, but it didn't work because the economics were wrong. The US had arguably the worst. Some would say it wasn't as bad as that. It was only the second worst Great Depression of any developed country in the world. It lasted from 1929 essentially until 1946, if you exclude the wartime period, during which, of course, the economy was producing lots of stuff, but not stuff that's valuable in the conventional economic sense of the word, because it was essentially weapons to go around killing people. So the economy was put together and put back to work in a sort of command economy style way. In other countries, the UK being a very good example, the Great Depression was much shorter. In the UK, the Great Depression lasted about 18 months, and by 1938, before the war started, the UK was back at the trend output level, not trend growth, trend output level. In other words, output in 1938 was at the level it would have been had the Great Depression never happened. And we did that despite a conservative fiscal policy. We obviously had a rather loose monetary policy after we came off the gold standard, and a broadly liberal approach to the supply side of the economy, including in relation to house building and things like that. Compare that with the United States, where you had marginal tax rates of 80, 90%. Policy switched on and off. Yes, new investment, but all of a sudden this investment ceased, and then it started again in the late 1930s. It was a complete policy shambles on the tax side, the regulation side, and the infrastructure side. I'm sure there are lots of good value infrastructure projects kicking around. Governments are not very good at choosing them. And the government should take those decisions on the same basis that it would take them in any other time, and that is the rate of return after adjusting for risk greater than the cost of the government of borrowing? After adjusting for risk is important. The cost of the government borrowing at the moment is zero. It really should try and put that risk and the cost of those projects onto the private sector. But if it can't, the decisions about investment should be no different in the next 20 years as they have been in the past 30 years. The decision criteria should remain the same. So I think it's just a terrible set of premises from which to work.
Well, I saw the others all nodding in agreement with you. Matt, when you hear the Conservative Prime Minister use the phrase a Rooseveltian approach, how do you react?
It makes me quite depressed, actually. It makes me think that, like Philip, they haven't really diagnosed the problem properly. This, as he rightly says, that this is a recession that's going to be caused by the fact that the government restricted revenue raising and economic activity, rightly, because it wanted to stop a public health crisis. That it is not a financial crisis. We're not facing a financial crisis of 2008. I'm exceptionally glad that unlike Roosevelt in 1929, the government in this country does not have control of the central bank, and therefore cannot implement his disastrous banking policies, which is what forced. When he came in in 1933, he instituted a bank holiday for 10 days, which wiped out half of America's banks, and ended up causing sort of the depression to rumble on and on and on, and left America in a much worse place by the time as compared to other countries in the West. Now, he actually died before he was able to implement his second New Deal. But a comparative one, so in 1945, Truman presented it to Congress. It included lots and lots of social spending programs, effectively a form of national health insurance. It included lots and lots of random investment projects, high taxes, increased marginal rates of tax across a whole bunch of things, including investment and employment. It was roundly rejected. Unfortunately, Britain had his version of a New Deal in the form of the Attlee government, swathes of nationalizations, control, command economies, directed investments. And we know what happened with that. America grew because it had tax cuts, it had deregulated the economy, and Europe did the same. And Germany had a massive increase in its private sector. And the UK became the sick man of Europe decades on. I'm very worried that this government seems to be learning the exact wrong lessons from the end of the Second World War. I'd rather that Boris Johnson tomorrow actually said, no, actually, I'm not a Rooseveltian. I'm actually still a Churchillian. I believe that the economy should be directed by the producers in it, by the free enterprise champions. His free trading idol, Churchill, is the man to be looking for right now, not big plans, big government men on the other side of the Atlantic.
Or Erhard from Germany.
Or indeed, yeah, Erhard from Germany is the perfect example for a man to copy.
Yes, Erhard's a really good example, and Walter Eichen was one of his advisors on that approach. And we'll put a link in the YouTube, hopefully, to our recent podcast interview with Christian Niemitz on Walter Eichen. John, when you hear about a Rooseveltian approach from a conservative prime minister, or any prime minister, is there any sympathy on your part?
Not much. I think it's one of these strange things where the myth, like Philip said, I mean, the kind of myth of Roosevelt bears very little relation to the actual policy framework of what he did. I think if we were going to look to the 30s, again, I'd look to the United Kingdom and what we did, not just in terms of cutting spending. It was actually a Labour chancellor that cut quite a lot of spending at the very beginning. Interestingly, but also, I mean, to return to my previous point about stamp duty, they did a hell of a lot of house building in the 1930s. I mean, it's kind of satirized in John Betjeman with Metro Land and stuff like that. But this is when our suburbs boomed. I think that's where I want to take some inspiration. I think I share Matt's kind of caution when it comes to big spending promises, but I would just wait and see what he actually announces on the spending side, because I think politicians have a tendency to announce what sound like very big numbers to often innumerate journalists, and then it turns out that it's actually 2 billion over 10 years or something, which amounts to sort of 15% of a 1 year's school budget, and it's really not that much money. So I would, some of this, him talking about being Roosevelt, is about optics and about showing that he's not just another Thatcherite kind of deregulator, which is a shame for those of us who wish he was. But it's all, it's about presenting himself as this sort of heterodox politician with a range of different sources. And we saw a bit of that with Michael Gove's speech the other day as well, when he starts his speech talking about Gramsci and, invoked FDR in that as well, as this kind of great progressive figure, which was very odd for a cabinet minister. So yeah, a bit concerned, but very much waiting for the detail on this.
So when we look at the battle against COVID, is it, are we no longer, Duncan, are we no longer looking at Churchill as our hero, but we're looking, so FDR as a great conservative hero? And what are you expecting, Duncan?
Well, as John and Philip have said, I mean, let's sort of wait and see tomorrow. But from what's been dripping out the last couple of days, it's not particularly encouraging. I mean, we've done numerous papers in the past which look into major capital projects of the government, and their record is lamentable. as Gog did actually allude to yesterday, I think he did pick up on defence procurements and recognise some of the errors within that. But until the government really has a very clear answer in terms of why exactly these issues keep returning decade after decade with all types of administrations, I think any kind of vague allusion to the build, build, build slogan is slightly worrying. And I think additionally, there really aren't that many shovel-ready projects. Obviously, HS2 is a dreadful project which we think should be scrapped. But ultimately, it's not going to be the case that workers can turn up to Euston on Monday morning and suddenly they can completely transform the station and carry on the track through Buckinghamshire in a matter of days. That doesn't function that way. So I think, I'm basically with John in terms of I think there'll be a lot of sort of quite slightly highfalutin language, but fundamentally the concern is that government directing investment does not have a good record doing that.
Well, before I turn to the questions for all of you, maybe I can ask one aspect of that, which maybe he's using the phrase Rooseveltian, because a recent YouGov poll has shown that Britain has turned away from austerity emphatically, with more people demanding tax rises to repair the public finances a decade after the coalition looked to balance the books. Now, of course, this is an opinion poll, and it's the way that the questions are asked. But what challenges might we all face in making the case for a smaller economy and for flatter, lower and simpler taxes? Why don't I start with you, Duncan?
Sure. Well, I think let's just take a step back and see exactly where we are. I mean, the national debt is now exceeding £2 trillion. Debt per person is into the high £20,000. The situation is, frankly, dire. So in as much as you have quite a few of these points which are made while borrowing is basically very cheap at the moment, the DMO, the Debt Management Office, has been very busy in the last couple of months. I think only today they've actually announced an increase in the amount of borrowing that they're doing over a 5-month period up to the end of August, which is approaching £300 billion. That's only halfway through the financial year. So the scale of this is quite enormous. I would be slightly more optimistic in terms of people being worried about this. I think what happened in 2015, the Conservative Party obviously made a very successful case to say that, well, we haven't quite finished the job of clearing away quite a bit of the overspending, and ultimately people were quite supportive of that. And I think, again, making these allusions to people who've had enough of austerity. Luckily, there wasn't austerity. I think I went through the figures the other day, and I think there was only one financial year from 2010 up to now where there was actually a decline in total managed expenditure, which is sort of all government expenditure effectively, in real terms. Obviously, on a per capita basis, there will be more than 1 year. So I think really it's our task to remind people that the scale of what we've got into, again through good intentions of what the government is doing to try and mitigate the worst effects of the pandemic, will have to be paid for. And that will mean many elements of social protection programs, such as pensions, will have to be looked at again. I think if the government, particularly on that basis, are not even willing to move from a triple lock to a double lock, that would be a very concerning indication in terms of how they plan to address the current debt stock.
John, are you as optimistic as Duncan is, or are you pessimistic that it's very difficult to make the case for simpler taxes, lower taxes, flatter taxes?
I think it is. I mean, especially for Boris Johnson, because they campaigned so hard on being this new model Tory party of public spending. I mean, remember the last Tory conference? It was, more funding for police, hospitals, schools. That was the big kind of tag, as well as obviously the Brexit stuff. And I think that's made even more politically difficult by the kind of massive love-in we've had for the NHS in the last 3 months. I mean, I'm nothing against NHS staff whatsoever, but it's just a fact of the matter that if you suggested for a moment cutting health spending, you'd be laughed out of the room in most political discussions at the moment. I think there's a broad, not just to do with COVID, I think there's a broader problem for free market advocates in that a lot of the positions that we tend to support are kind of third order propositions. So you say to someone, oh, we should tax the rich and spend more on services. They'll go, yeah, that sounds right. If you then come in and sound like the kind of pedant going, oh, well, actually, what might happen is that if you tax the rich, they'll go elsewhere and then we'll have less money. It's a much more complicated, less slogany kind of case to make. And I think that's just a general difficulty for free marketeers. I'm not, the first person to discuss that. So no, I'm not particularly optimistic about that we're going to have some kind of deregulatory or tax flattening spree, particularly with the kind of Rooseveltian spending stuff we're going to hear about tomorrow, unfortunately.
Matt, are you pessimistic as well, or are you optimistic about the fact that we can make the case for lower taxes, a smaller state, flatter taxes?
Well, this government has within it an instinctual base and sort of philosophical underpinning of like free markets, which the last one did not have. But it also has behind it a majority that relied on an electoral strategy of what Jeremy Driver calls hang the pedos, fund the NHS, which is the true centre ground of British politics. And that requires quite interventionist policies, which is why you see this sort of, in order to maintain, which is why you sort of see this Rooseveltian style demand for command and control re-enter. But we've done some polling too. We did some polling back in April, and we asked people whether they wanted tax cuts or whether they wanted spend more directed investments, we say. And it actually turns out that almost 3/4 went for reducing taxes after the lockdown to boost growth and jobs, while only less than 1 in 10 disagreed with that. It was actually younger voters that were more in favour of tax cuts than older voters in that survey. And it was, of those aged between 18 and 34, 44% were strongly in support of that. So the idea that our messages can't be heard if they're made to them is a different one. However, the idea that we do have to rely on the government to actually sort of make the case for lower taxes. If they just make a case that, austerity for thee but not for me, which is the sort of the idea that, government spending is the only form of austerity. If you raise taxes, that's austerity for other people in the economy. Actually, you have to tighten your belt as a family. You have to tighten your belt as a business. Unfortunately, they're not. No one in the country is going to hear a message for low taxes because the other parties just want more spending, and you're then back into a bidding war over who's spending more on what, and voters who maybe a little bit more inclined to actually want a bit more private investment, private sector economy, private-led recovery, have nowhere to go. So I'm a little bit pessimistic, but there's always space for a new party to emerge if they want to.
And on that, Philip, you're one of the authors. I think you edited the book, the Tax and Growth book from the IEA a couple of years ago, where you suggested a number of taxes to be cut or reduced. Is it much more difficult to make that case now? Are you pessimistic about being able to make that case? You're muted.
Yeah. I'm pessimistic that the government really understands that the case can be successfully made. So I've made this point before that sometimes you go into churches and you see 70-year-olds with guitars around their neck thinking, we must start singing Come By Ya, My Lord, and all the young people will flock in. And actually what young people want in churches is dignified, reverent liturgy and Gregorian chant. I think when I listen to Conservatives sometimes from the South and East, they think that all the people who voted for them in the North want big government. The North has never, I come from Yorkshire myself, and particularly that part of the North, has never been a big government place by and large. Unionised Labour, of course, was in favour by and large of socialism, but sort of, mind your own business conservatism, it's my money, I'll spend it how I want, is a sort of message which voters are quite capable of, from the North, are quite capable of communicating to politicians, and I think politicians should listen to that. So, and it may be that deregulation, when we talk about things like deregulation, perhaps it doesn't come from the kind of places that you might we might have had it in the 1980s and 1990s. But I think there's an appetite. There isn't an appetite for big government, high levels of regulation and high levels of taxation amongst all those new voters which voted for the Conservative Party largely in the north of England. I suppose the other thing I would say is that I think the government's in a bit of a box. And I think it should try and get across the message that there's no question about austerity. The question is it private sector austerity, in other words, tax increases, public sector austerity, in other words, government spending cuts, or next generation austerity, in other words, high levels of government borrowing? I think it should pose the issues to the electorate in that way. And you can reduce the total level of austerity by having more economic growth, of course, and by deregulation. But I think the government is going to struggle, in fact, to increase spending all that much in any case. I don't think there's room I don't think there's that much extra taxable capacity. Tax receipts will fall in any case. And I don't think that any Chancellor of the Exchequer will want to borrow at a rate greater than nominal GDP growth for very many more years to come. So I don't think, actually, the government will do much on the spending side when push comes to shove.
Okay, well, look, we've got a few minutes left, and I just want to get to some of the questions. So let's get to, if I can ask you for almost a quick fire round, as it were. A question from Matt Carter. What does the panel think about government plans for temporary VAT cuts? Start with you, Philip.
Oh, I don't approve of that at all. It will have to be reversed. There's then all the uncertainty which arises and all the problems which will arise when it's eventually reversed.
For temporary VAT cuts. Start with you, Philip.
If it increases government borrowing, there's potentially an impact of that on the exchange rate. You know, it just creates a kind of policy uncertainty, which was really the problem with FDR's policy in the United States in the 1930s. Strongly against it.
Yeah.
What about you?
Awful.
That's a lovely succinct answer. Duncan?
Yeah, it's a bad idea. I mean, there's data out tomorrow on the household savings rate. So for the Q1 this year, and you'll likely see a very substantial increase in the amount of money people are putting aside. So stimulating demand through a VAT cut is not necessary at this stage. And as Philip alludes to, it's just further complication in already wildly complex taxation.
John, you're ready to answer?
Yeah, pretty much what Duncan said. I mean, the problem here isn't that people aren't buying stuff because it's not cheap enough. It's because they're scared. And cutting VAT is not going to change that. So, yeah, I think it's a waste of money and an additional complication that we don't need.
Actually, it'll make them more scared because they'll be scared of future tax rises.
And there'll be more people piling into the shops. So, yeah.
And John, I'm going to stay with you to start off with the next question, which is in the same City AM article. There are a number of other ideas. I'm going to read out three of the ideas. I just wanted to know your thoughts on the three. One of them was from Adelshaw Goddard, use the tax system to protect key workers. Tax Justice UK said tax wealth better. And Evershed Sutherland said introduce Boris bounce back bonds. I'm sure you've got some views about those. Let's start with you, John.
Well, the protecting key workers one, as far as I remember, is basically sort of ensuring they have a set number of hours, which I don't think is a good idea at all. It comes back to this complete fallacy about so-called 0 hours contracts. Very against that. The bounce back Boris cards, I think, is like a comically bad idea. I think it's especially because in the article you can only spend them on certain things and then they expire after a certain period. So if people are stuck at home self-isolating, they won't get to take advantage of this extra £300 largesse from the government. Yeah, not a good idea. Although I was talking to Matt about this earlier, and he did suggest that perhaps if you could only spend it on junk food, it might be a nice 2 fingers to the health hobby. So, you know, that's an idea. And I forget what the second one you said was.
It was to tax wealth better or whatever.
Oh, well, you know, every left-wing organisation says this every couple of months. So fine. I mean, they say it'll only raise 11 billion or something themselves. So it's really not a big idea, is it?
And quite often they don't know the difference between wealth and income. They assume they're the same thing.
Yeah, no, I think we should tax wealth better. But what they're proposing is, like you said, it's an income tax change. It's not.
Yeah. And Duncan, what did you think of those three ideas? Any of them caught your eye? Any of them favourites with you?
Well, I think focusing on the wealth tax idea, it's emphasising just how terrible this is when it's been tried elsewhere. I mean, so Sweden, for example, what did theirs in 2007, 2008, and they had it for 100 years beforehand. In the years preceding that, there's something like 1.5 trillion krona, which left the country over about a 15-year period. So in sterling, that's £100 billion-ish of that kind of period. And so lo and behold, there was quite a substantial return in France. That was abolished by, I think, Macron in 2017, I think it was. And I think the final years before that, the revenue raised from it was nothing, I think about 3.5 billion euros, but the revenue lost was twice that. So time and time again, the capital flight is endemic whenever this is implemented. So any kind of vague allusion to that is difficult to do. And I think beyond that as well, I think it's quite difficult argument, optically to sustain, because ultimately it's quite a punitive thing to do. And I think reflecting on what happened in the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, obviously had elements like the bankers' levy and alteration to how bankers and financial services people were actually remunerated as kind of punishment. But obviously this time round, it's a global pandemic, so there's no group of workers or particular individuals who are at fault for actually creating the situation. So to present that just seems a rather peculiar thing to do.
Matt, are we going to see the ASI advocating any of these three ideas? Protecting key workers, tax wealth better, or a Boris bounce back bond?
You know what? I'm going to stick out my head and keep my reputation as a professional troll and say, yeah, we should have the Boris bounce back bonds, but you should only be able to spend it on alcohol, cigarettes, and crisps, and just really annoy all the right people. But obviously, it's a bad idea. It's a bad idea. They're all bad ideas. The wealth one, especially, for exactly the same reason. But as the other guest just said, but on top of that, what we need to do is have more money coming into the country. We need to make it easier bring down capital gains tax. We need to make it easier to bring back money from tax havens, because actually what you want is investment into the country right now, after having lost some wealth to spending on the pandemic. So all of these are bad ideas that are basically just shuffling money around, and also having a weird belief that the UK is a closed economy. We're not a closed economy. We're a global inward investing and outward investing country. So we'll be the linchpin of other countries' economies too. We want to make sure that other countries that are parcel of our wealth creating capacity want to bring their money in here, want to invest here, and want to make returns here.
And finally, Philip, do you have any sympathy or understanding for those three other ideas?
Well, I must admit, I'm not sure what the bounce back bonds are, so I'll leave that one. I agree with John entirely on the question of the key workers and not guaranteeing hours there. I think our labour market functions very well. It's one of the things which doesn't need fixing. When it comes to taxing wealth better, well, I'm a long time proponent of a tax on imputed income from rent on owner-occupied property, but that's not really a wealth tax. It's a tax on imputed income, because if you're an owner-occupier, you're essentially renting the house to yourself, and if you rented it from a landlord, you'd have to pay tax. The landlord would have to pay tax on the rent. Now, if you did that, it would provide you with a whole a revenue stream which would allow you to abolish stamp duty, which is a tax on wealth, and a different type of property tax, and abolish inheritance tax as well, and probably do a few other things too. So yes, you would actually move the tax base from wealth, inheritance tax, and stamp duty toward income, which is where it should be, because after all, wealth is simply accumulated income, and to tax people on their accumulated income is a direct attack on property. And I don't think any government should be, which is actually elected by and large, its primary function is to protect property. I think if a government actually starts attacking property itself, that's fundamentally perverting what government should be about. John mentioned that this is a sort of perennial idea of the left. It's also a perennial idea of many people who write on Con Home as well, including Tim Montgomery and a number of Conservative MPs. They sort of talk about wealth as if it's an entirely independent entity from income, rather than as if wealth is something that's accumulated out of income. And the message you send if you tax wealth is, oh, if you squander your income, that's okay, but if you keep it, we'll tax it. I don't think that's a good message.
Well, let's hope that Conservative MPs do understand what wealth is about. Let's hope that we don't see literally a Rooseveltian approach. Philip, Matt, John, Duncan, thank you very much for joining us tonight for the Definite article. Tomorrow night at 6 o'clock, we will be hearing from a Conservative MP. Danny Kruger, a Conservative thinker, advisor, and now an MP, will be joining us in conversation at 6 o'clock. On Wednesday, from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock, we'll have Dr. Pierre Desrochers of the Fraser Institute on the case against food sovereignty. And Thursday evening, just before Man City offer a guard of honour to Liverpool as Premier League champions, you can tell I've waited 30 years to say that, we have the return of our own Premier champion of free markets, Mark Littlewood, who will be back with Live with Littlewood at 6 o'clock on Thursday evening. For more details of all our online content and to stay updated on our online activity, please visit our website, ia.org.uk. Check out our YouTube channel, IA London, the one you're watching. Please hit the subscribe button. Listen to our podcast on Podbean and subscribe to our daily newsletter. And to help us keep providing free content during these tough times, please do consider making a contribution, no matter how modest, by donating online at ia.org.uk. Thank you to our guests for joining us. Thank you to our viewers for watching today. We hope that you'll join us again soon. Stay safe and see you at a future IA webinar. Thank you.